If you grew up black in America between 1960 and 1995, whether in a shotgun house in New Orleans, an apartment in Harlem, or a row house on the west side of Chicago, your household ran on rules that were never written down. Every child on the block knew them because the consequences for forgetting were immediate. But those rules did not come from nowhere. They grew out of a history that an entire generation still carries. These are 12 unwritten rules that shaped black childhood discipline and how they quietly changed everything. Number 1, yes ma'am, no sir, and why politeness was survival. In black households across the American South and later in the northern cities where the Great Migration carried those same families, the rule was absolute. When an adult spoke to you, you answered with yes ma'am or no sir. Never yeah, never uh-huh, and definitely never a shrug. This was not about being old-fashioned for its own sake. For generations of black families living under Jim Crow in places like Birmingham, Alabama, and Jackson, Mississippi, teaching a child to speak with politeness and precision was a form of protection. A black child who could address any adult of any background with composure and clarity was a child who stood a better chance in a world that judged harshly and forgave slowly. The courtesy was real, but the strategy underneath it was deliberate. By the time the civil rights marches and sit-ins of the 1960s reshaped the legal landscape, the habit had already been woven into the cultural fabric. Grandmothers in Memphis and Detroit and Baltimore all enforced the same standard because they remembered what happened when a young person was perceived as disrespectful in the wrong setting. The lesson traveled through families like water through roots. And even after the Civil Rights Act changed the law, the training continued because the instinct behind it had not yet become unnecessary. But polite words were only the beginning of the discipline system inside those households, because sometimes the correction did not even require a single word. Number 2, the look. Every black child who grew up in this era can describe it. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a tilt of the head, the way a mother or grandmother could be sitting across a crowded church sanctuary, maybe at a Baptist church in Atlanta or an AME church in Philadelphia, 15 rows away, and still deliver a message so clear it might as well have been a bullhorn. The look was the original wireless communication system. It meant sit down, stop touching your sibling, fix your face, or some combination of all three. And the thing that still surprises people is that it almost always worked. Children did not need to hear a voice. They just needed to catch that glance, and the correction happened instantly. What made the look so effective was not fear alone. It was the relationship behind it. A child who loved and respected the adult giving that glance responded because they understood the weight of disappointing that person. The look carried authority because it came from someone who had earned it through daily presence, daily sacrifice, and the kind of consistency that no parenting manual could replicate. That nonverbal discipline extended into other areas too, especially the things a family considered sacred. And nothing was more sacred than how you presented yourself on a Sunday morning. Number 3, church clothes stayed church clothes. In black households of the 1960s and 70s, Sunday outfits existed in a category entirely separate from every other piece of clothing you owned. Your church shoes did not touch the playground. Your Sunday dress or your pressed slacks did not get worn to a neighbor's house on a Tuesday afternoon. The moment you came home from service, you changed immediately. The preparation for Sunday morning was itself a disciplined routine. Shoes were polished the night before, dresses were ironed and hung on the back of the bedroom door, hair was pressed or braided with the kind of care that turned a bathroom into a salon. Children learned to sit still through the process, because fidgeting while someone held a hot comb near your ear was not an option. This was about more than keeping clothes clean, although keeping clothes clean when when money was tight was no small thing, but the deeper lesson was about distinction. The separation between Sunday attire and everyday wear taught children that certain occasions carried a higher level of respect. You dressed up for church because church was important. You took care of those garments because they represented something beyond yourself. For many families, Sunday clothes were a visible expression of dignity in a society that often worked to deny it. A black family walking up the steps of a church in 1972, mothers in hats and gloves, fathers in their best suits, every child, pressed and polished, was making a statement about self-respect that ran deeper than fashion. You could see it in the congregations filing into churches all across the South and in the northern cities too, from Ebenezer Baptist in Atlanta to Abyssinian Baptist in Harlem. And the children absorbed that message even before they had words for it. But the discipline of Sunday morning was just one piece of a broader system, and the next rule showed up every single evening at the dinner table. Number 4, you ate what was cooked. There was no children's menu in a black household of this era, no separate chicken nuggets while the adults ate something else. Whatever mama or grandmama put on the table was dinner. You ate it, you said thank you, and you did not complain. This rule functioned on several levels at once. On the surface, it was practical. Families stretching a single income, or sometimes with no stable income at all, could not afford to cook multiple meals. Neck bones and rice fed everybody the same way. But underneath the practicality was a deeper lesson about gratitude and the refusal to cultivate entitlement. A child who learned to eat what was prepared without protest was a child who understood that the world did not revolve around their preferences. That might sound harsh by today's standards, but the parents enforcing this rule had grown up during times when food itself was not guaranteed, and they were not about to raise children who took a full plate for granted. There was also an unspoken lesson about resourcefulness baked into the cooking itself. Black kitchens of this era turned humble ingredients from corner grocery stores and neighborhood butcher shops into something meaningful. Oxtails, ham hocks, black-eyed peas, and cornbread were not considered lesser food. They were the centerpiece, prepared with a skill and a patience that had been passed down through generations of cooks from the rural South to the urban North. A child who sat at that table was learning that dignity has nothing to do with expense. The dinner table rule also meant you stayed seated until everyone was finished. You did not get up, wander off, or start playing. The meal was a family event, not a solo activity. Therefore, the table became one of the earliest training grounds for patience and shared space. And if the dinner table taught patience, the kitchen table afterward taught something even more demanding. Number 5, homework before anything. In black homes across America, the rule was clear. When you walked in from school, you sat down and did your homework before you turned on the television, before you picked up a basketball, and before you stepped one foot outside. Education was not treated as optional or even as a personal goal. It was treated as a debt. Many of the parents and grandparents enforcing this rule had been denied full access to education themselves. Segregated schools with peeling paint and hand-me-down textbooks, underfunded classrooms where 30 children shared 15 desks, and the economic pressures that pulled black children out of school and into field labor were still living memories in these households. Some of these adults had walked past the all-white school on the other side of town every morning on their way to their own. So when a grandmother in 1978 sat a child down at the kitchen table and stood over them while they finished long division, she was not just checking homework. She was honoring every ancestor who had been forbidden to read. The kitchen table became the study hall. The overhead light became the library lamp. And the supervising adult, who sometimes could not help with the math, but who could certainly tell whether you were actually trying, became the accountability system. If you stared at the same page for too long, they noticed. If you tried to rush through and write sloppy answers, they sent you back to do it again. The standard was not perfection. The standard was effort. In many households, older siblings carried part of this responsibility too. A teenager who had already passed through the same coursework would sit with a younger brother or sister and walk them through the problems. That kind of peer teaching was not optional. It was expected because the family's investment in education was collective, not individual. No child was going to waste the chance that earlier generations had been denied. That was the unspoken contract. But the homework table was not the only place where accountability operated. It was reinforced by a network of adults that extended far beyond the front door of any single household. And that is where the next rule came in. Number 6, the whole neighborhood could discipline you. This might be the rule that separated the old school from the new school more than any other. In black neighborhoods of the 1960s through the 1980s, from the tree-lined blocks of Prince George's County, Maryland, to the shotgun house streets of the 9th Ward in New Orleans, any adult on the block had the authority to correct someone else's child. If Miss Johnson down the street saw you throwing rocks at cars, she did not wait to locate your mother. She handled it herself right there on the sidewalk. By the time the child got home, the phone call had already arrived and the correction happened all over again. The neighborhood functioned as an extended family, a web of aunties, uncles, church members, and longtime neighbors who all operated under the same understanding. Every child belonged to every adult, at least when it came to keeping them in line. A kid could not act up 3 blocks from home and assume nobody would find out. Word traveled through that network faster than the child could run. This system worked because it was built on trust. Parents trusted their neighbors to correct with the same values they used at home. And neighbors took that responsibility seriously because they understood that the alternative, a child growing up without boundaries, affected everyone on the block. However, neighborhood discipline was just the public-facing layer. Inside the house, an entirely different performance was expected the moment company walked through the door. Number 7, company manners. When guests arrived at a black household, whether it was a small apartment in Newark or a family home in Oakland, children knew exactly what to do. You greeted every adult by name. You offered something to drink. If they were older, you offered your seat on the sofa in the living room. Once you had done your part, unless you were specifically invited to stay, you made yourself scarce. This was not about hiding children or treating them as unimportant. It was about teaching them to read a room. When adults were talking, children were expected to understand that the conversation was not for them, and that demanding attention in the middle of it was a violation of the social order. You learned to listen without inserting yourself, to observe without performing, and to wait your turn. Company manners also taught children that hospitality was a reflection of the entire family. If a guest walked into the house and a child was rude, loud, or disrespectful, that reflected on the parents. And in a community where reputation carried real weight, no parent was willing to let that slide. Therefore, children practiced a version of social diplomacy long before they understood the concept. There was also a flip side to company manners that nobody talked about, but every child understood. When the adults gathered in the living room and started talking in lower voices, that usually meant the conversation was about something serious, money trouble, family drama, somebody's marriage falling apart. Children learn to pick up those signals from a distance, even while pretending to be busy in another room. The skill of listening without appearing to listen became second nature in these households. The expectations did not relax when the guests left either, because long before company arrived, there was another daily requirement that had to be met. Number 8, chores before play, every single day. You did not step outside to play until your bed was made, the dishes were washed, the floor was swept, and whatever else needed doing was done. Whether your family lived in a small apartment in the projects of the South Bronx or a single family home in a black suburb outside of Houston, the standard was the same. This was not negotiable. It was not a reward system where completing tasks earned points toward playtime. It was simply the order of operations. Work first, everything else second. For children in these households, chores began early. A 5-year-old could be responsible for making their own bed. A 7-year-old was expected to wash dishes. By 10 or 11, some children were helping with laundry, cooking simple meals, and looking after younger siblings. The household ran on shared labor, and every member, regardless of age, contributed. What this built over time was a deep sense of responsibility and routine. You did not wait to be told. You knew your tasks, and you did them because that was what a functioning household required. The connection between effort and earned leisure became instinctive. Play was sweeter because you had earned it with your hands first. But discipline in this era was not always quiet, and the next rule is one that the generation discusses with complicated honesty. Number 9, the switch. There is no way to talk about black childhood discipline in this era without addressing corporal punishment. It could be a belt pulled from the closet, a switch from the tree out back that you sometimes had to go pick yourself, or a wooden spoon grabbed from the kitchen drawer. Sometimes it was an extension cord. These were part of the landscape, and nearly every black child of this generation has a story. The cultural context matters here. For many of these families, physical discipline had roots that stretched back through slavery on the plantations of the Deep South and through Reconstruction, eras when black parents believed, sometimes correctly, that strict physical correction at home could prevent a child from encountering far worse punishment outside of it. In the Jim Crow South, where a black teenager could face violence for looking at a white person the wrong way, a child who learned to obey immediately without hesitation was a child who might survive an encounter with the kind of authority that did not care about explanations. That does not mean every adult who used a switch was thinking in those terms. Some were simply repeating what had been done to them. And the generation that grew up under this system holds a wide range of feelings about it. But that range of feelings is exactly what makes this rule different from the others on this list. Some remember it with humor, telling stories about outrunning a grandmother through the living room. Others carry genuine pain from moments that cross the line from discipline into something harder to justify. Honesty requires acknowledging both realities. The discipline was real, and the love behind it, in the majority of cases, was real too. But so was the complexity, and as the generation aged and eventually became parents themselves, many chose to draw the line differently. That tension between honoring what shaped you and choosing a different path is one of the most defining features of this era. If you are finding this helpful, hit subscribe. We cover Black history and culture every week, and there is a lot more to unpack. Now, if the switch was the most complicated rule on this list, the next one was probably the simplest. Number 10, when the streetlights came on, you came home. You did not need a watch, a phone call, or any kind of negotiation. When those amber streetlights flickered to life in the early evening, Every child on the block knew exactly what it meant. Get home now. The streetlight curfew was one of the most universal rules in black neighborhoods during this entire era. Children spent hours outside after school and on weekends, riding bikes through the streets of Atlanta, playing double dutch on the sidewalks of Chicago, running through open fire hydrants in Brooklyn during the summer. The outdoor freedom was enormous by today's standards, but it came with one absolute boundary, and that boundary was the light. What made this system work was its simplicity and its visibility. Every child could see the streetlights. Every parent knew when they turned on. There was no ambiguity, no argument about what time it was, and no excuse for being late. The consequence for ignoring the streetlights was waiting at the front door in the form of a parent who had been watching the street from the window. There was a whole culture built around those final minutes before the lights clicked on. Games of tag got faster and more desperate as the sky turned orange over the rooftops. Older kids negotiated one more play at the basketball hoop on the corner. Younger ones started drifting toward their front porches because they had learned the hard way what happened if the lights beat them home. The streetlight rule also taught children to self-regulate. You learned to keep track of the fading daylight over the rooftops of the neighborhood. You learned to wrap up your game before the lights clicked on rather than scrambling afterward. And you learned that freedom, even the glorious freedom of a summer evening on the block, had a limit. The freedom was real, but so was the fence around it. And understanding both was part of growing up in those neighborhoods. That sense of limits carried over into the way children were expected to use their words inside the family home, especially when speaking to the people who raised them. Number 11, no talking back. In these households, the line between expressing yourself and disrespecting an elder was drawn with absolute precision. You could disagree with a parent or grandparent. You could even, in some homes, ask a respectful question about a decision. But you could not roll your eyes. You could not suck your teeth. You could not raise your voice. And you certainly could not say anything that sounded like you believed you were the adult's equal in that moment. The talking back rule was about hierarchy. And in black families of this era, hierarchy was clear. Adults made the decisions. Children followed them. If you did not understand why, you trusted that the adult had reasons you could not yet see. And if you tested that structure, the response was swift. But here is what made this rule more complicated than it first appears. There was a particular art to how children in these households learned to communicate their feelings without crossing the line. The tone mattered as much as the words. A sentence spoken quietly and without attitude at the kitchen table might get a thoughtful response from a parent. The same sentence delivered with a neck roll or a raised eyebrow could change the entire evening. Children became students of tone, volume, and timing because the consequences of misjudging any one of those things were immediate. And the training ran deeper than just knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. Children in these homes learned to read the energy of a room before they opened their mouths. They could tell when a parent had come home from a long shift and needed silence. They could sense when a grandmother was in a mood that allowed for questions and when she was not. That kind of emotional intelligence was not taught in any classroom, but it was tested every single day inside the walls of the family home. This skill carried forward into adulthood in ways that are not always recognized. A generation of black professionals who could sit in a corporate boardroom, navigate a tense parent-teacher conference at a public school, or handle a traffic stop with composure, learned that navigation first at the kitchen table, not in a corporate training seminar. The restraint was not weakness. It was preparation for a world that would not always give them the benefit of the doubt. And if those daily rules governed the weekdays inside the house, there was one final ritual at the dining room table that held the entire system together every 7 days without fail. Number 12. Sunday dinner was mandatory. Every Sunday afternoon in homes across Black America, the table was set. The food was serious. We are talking about fried chicken, collard greens, macaroni and cheese, cornbread, sweet potato pie, and whatever else Grandmama decided to make that week. The table was covered, the chairs were full, and every member of the family was expected to be there. The preparation alone was a ritual. Grandmothers and mothers started cooking early in the morning, sometimes before church. A black kitchen on a Sunday morning smelled like a history lesson. Cast iron skillets, seasoned over decades, sat on every burner. Cornbread batter mixed from a recipe that nobody had ever written down because it lived in muscle memory went into the oven. Collard greens simmered low and slow with a ham hock that somebody had been saving all week. Children who wandered into that kitchen were usually put to work, snapping green beans or setting the table, but they were also absorbing something they would carry for the rest of their lives. Sunday dinner was more than a meal. It was the connective tissue of the family itself. The place where cousins caught up, where grandparents told stories from the old neighborhood, where the younger children watched and listened and absorbed the rhythms of adult conversation. News got shared over second helpings. Conflicts were quietly resolved between bites of sweet potato pie, and a child could feel, without anyone having to explain it, that they belonged to something larger than themselves. The table also functioned as a weekly reset. Whatever had happened during the week, whether a child had gotten in trouble at school, whether an uncle had lost a job, whether someone was feuding with a neighbor, Sunday dinner was the place where the family came back together. The act of sitting down, passing the dishes, and eating together smoothed over the rough edges of the previous 7 days. The food was the medium, but the message was presence. Showing up mattered. Being at the table meant you were part of the family, and being part of the family meant you carried its standards with you through the rest of the week. The 12 rules on this list were not enforced by any single person or any single moment. They were reinforced every Sunday at that table through the simple act of gathering. And that may be the most important thing to understand about how Black children were raised in this era. The discipline was not random, and it was not harsh for the sake of being harsh. It was a system built by people who understood that the world outside their front door operated by rules that were not always fair. Therefore, the rules inside the home had to be clear, consistent, and strong enough to prepare a child for anything. When those Sunday dinners started to fade, when families scattered to different cities and the old neighborhood networks thinned out, something shifted. The rules did not vanish overnight. They loosened slowly, one generation at a time, as new parenting philosophies arrived and the economic pressures that had once kept extended families close together changed shape. Grandmothers who had been the anchor of the system aged and passed on, and the kitchens where those Sunday dinners happened in those old houses in places like the South Side of Chicago and the Fifth Ward of Houston and the West End of Louisville sometimes became quiet. Whether that shift was progress or loss depends on who you ask. But the generation that lived inside those 12 rules still carries them. They greet a stranger with "yes, ma'am" without even thinking about it. They set a table with care, even when nobody is coming over. And on a summer evening, they still instinctively check the sky for fading light. Even though the streetlight curfew ended decades ago, the rules are still in there, written on something deeper than paper. If this brought back memories, subscribe and stay with us.
We go deeper into the world that shaped this generation every week, and there is so much more to remember together. Remember.